They say some stories fade with time, but some stay buried in the sand, just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. It was a crisp October morning in 1995 when a woman walking her dog stumbled upon a body on Bomeris Beach in Tasmania. Face down in the surf, half submerged by the tide, the young woman appeared almost asleep. But the brutality written across her body told a very different story. She had been stabbed again and again, her face shattered, her teeth missing. A horrifying scene in broad daylight on a quiet, peaceful stretch of coastline. Her name was Victoria Anna Elizabeth Cafasso, a 20-year-old law student whose life had barely begun. Who killed her, and why? Decades later, those questions still hang unanswered over the windswept beach where she was found. And the tiny coastal community where it happened, once so trusting, has never been the same. This is the story of a young woman who loved adventure, chased knowledge, and believed in the goodness of people, until she crossed paths with something or someone evil. This is the haunting case of Victoria Cafasso and the mystery that refuses to die. Welcome. This is Crime Uncovered, where every case has a story, and the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction. If you haven't subscribed yet, kindly do so to stay updated on the latest crimes we uncover. Who was Victoria Cafasso? Victoria was the kind of person people remembered. Born on June 8, 1975, in Surrey, England, she had a magnetic warmth, a quiet intelligence, and the gift of making strangers feel like friends. But although she was born in the UK, her childhood unfolded along the Italian Riviera, in the town of Ospedaletti, where she grew up surrounded by beauty, privilege, and possibility. She was fluent in 3 languages, English, Italian, and French, and excelled in academics. Her father, a respected Italian lawyer, had high hopes that she would follow in his footsteps, and she might have. Victoria enrolled in law school in Italy, committed to a future of justice and advocacy. But there was another force shaping her, a different pull entirely. Her mother, who ran a travel business, had instilled in her a love for exploration, and it stuck. Victoria was adventurous, curious, and constantly drawn to new places, new cultures, new people. So, at 20, during a break from university, she made a decision. She would travel. First, she told her family she was heading to England to spend time with her grandparents. Her father was hesitant. He was worried, but Victoria was grown now and determined. What no one expected was what came next. While in England, Victoria contacted a cousin she barely knew, Simon Howard Dales, who lived in Bomeris, a quiet coastal village on the eastern shore of Tasmania, Australia. They'd only met a couple of times, but Victoria asked if she could visit and stay with him for a while. Simon said yes, and with that, she was off again. This time to the far reaches of the southern hemisphere, chasing warmth, waves, and the promise of new experiences. She arrived in Tasmania on October 6, 1995, after a long international flight. Simon and a friend met her at the airport, and together they drove the scenic coastal roads to Bomeris. Along the way, they stopped at Shirley's Lookout, a local cliffside viewpoint where Victoria first laid eyes on the sea that would, days later, become her grave. When Victoria arrived in Bomeris, she stepped into a world that felt like it had been frozen in time. The village was small, a stretch of modest homes nestled between sea and bushland, home to a few hundred residents. Most of the locals were fishermen, surfers, retirees, or travelers just passing through. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and everyone nodded at each other on the street. Simon had been renting a small home near the beach. It was simple but cozy, just a short walk from the shoreline. For Victoria, fresh off a long international journey, it was perfect, calm, secluded, a stark contrast from the noise of London or the busyness of European cities. She was eager to unwind and settle in, if only for a short while. On the drive into town, they stopped at Shirley's Lookout, and there she met 3 locals, including a woman named Hilda Jackson. Despite being complete strangers, Victoria and Hilda hit it off almost instantly. Hilda would later describe Victoria as gentle, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful, with a soft-spoken charm that made people immediately comfortable. Others, too, noticed something uncanny. The two women bore a remarkable resemblance to each other. They were around the same age, same height, and had similarly delicate features. That likeness would become a chilling point of speculation later on. Victoria's time in Bomeris was brief, but she tried to make the most of it. On October 9th, just 3 days after arriving, she visited Hilda at her home. The two women spent about 30 minutes chatting, making plans to meet again in the coming days. That evening, Victoria attended a small birthday gathering at a house owned by a local woman named Mandy, the same property Simon was renting. The next day, she took a solo walk through the neighborhood, enjoying the ocean air and getting a feel for the village. She seemed to be settling in, observing, absorbing, but the clock was already ticking. October 11th, 1995. The day began like any other. Victoria woke early. Around 8:10 a.m., she told Simon she was heading down to the beach for a morning walk and asked if she could borrow his small carrier bag to take along. The two shared a quick breakfast. They chatted casually, nothing out of the ordinary. At 9 a.m., she stepped out the door and began walking toward Bomeris Beach. It was a warm day, the sky clear, the wind mild. About an hour later, several people reported seeing her sunbathing alone, roughly 700 meters south of the beach's entrance, not far from the Surfside Hotel. One of those people was Hilda Jackson. Hilda had hoped to run into Victoria again. She noticed her lying in the sun as she herself began her daily jog. But instead of running past Victoria's spot, she chose to jog in the opposite direction, into the wind, to make her return leg easier. It was a small, practical decision. A decision Hilda would later replay in her mind for years. Because had she turned left instead of right, she might have seen something, might have stopped something, might have saved a life. It was just after 1:30 p.m. when a woman named Margaret, a local resident, took her dog for a walk along the shoreline, something she'd done countless times before. The beach was familiar, safe, a place of peace. But that day, something felt different. As she walked near the edge of the tide, her dog sniffing and wandering ahead, Margaret spotted something unusual further down the sand, a shape near the waterline that didn't belong. She squinted against the sun, expecting perhaps driftwood or an abandoned towel flapping in the breeze. But as she drew closer, her steps slowed. Her breath caught. It was a body. A young woman lay face down, partially unclothed, the gentle waves lapping at her lifeless form, slowly tugging her into the sea. Margaret froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. The image was surreal, something out of a nightmare. She turned and ran, as fast as her legs would carry her, to the nearest house. 2 men answered the door. Still breathless and panicked, she told them what she'd seen. The men followed her back to the beach, and what they found confirmed Margaret's worst fears. The scene wasn't a drowning. It wasn't an accident. It was a murder. Police were called immediately. Word spread quickly. In a town this small, tragedy doesn't whisper. It screams. Sirens pierced the air. Curious locals gathered near the dunes, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. The woman on the beach was identified shortly after as Victoria Cafasso. The young law student who had arrived just 5 days earlier, full of life and plans, was now gone. What happened next should have been a precise, methodical effort to preserve every clue. But instead, the crime scene became a lesson in what not to do. For reasons still criticized to this day, police failed to secure the crime scene immediately. Curious locals, drawn by the chaos, began to gather along the sand dunes. Some wandered dangerously close. Footprints, potential evidence, and the integrity of the site were all compromised. One footprint in particular, spotted in the sand near the struggle site, stood out. Could have belonged to the killer. But instead of preserving multiple impressions, investigators made just one single plaster cast. It was poorly made. The cast lacked detail, and later, forensic experts declared it useless for comparison. No backup prints, no measurements, no clear pattern data. A crucial piece of evidence ruined. But that wasn't the only mistake. Before proper documentation could be done, Victoria's body was moved, and covered hastily with a blue tarp to shield her from onlookers. In doing so, investigators introduced new fibers to the scene. They disturbed key placements, the kind that could have indicated direction of movement, attacker positioning, or final moments. Even worse, the state forensic pathologist never came to the scene. That absence delayed and weakened the official reconstruction of what happened. Photographs were limited. No video was taken. No detailed crime scene map was drawn before everything was altered. Forensic timelines became vague. The early hours of any homicide investigation are sacred. In Victoria's case, they were squandered. It was as if the killer had vanished into the sea, and the evidence that could have pointed to them had been washed away just as quickly. As news of the murder spread across Tasmania and then to international headlines, Victoria's family, devastated and in disbelief, boarded a flight from Italy. They stood in tears on the very beach where their daughter's life was taken. Back in Italy, her father, once a towering figure in her life, grew withdrawn and grief-stricken. It was discovered that Victoria had written them a letter just days before she died. In it, she told them she was happy, grateful, and excited to be exploring Australia. That handwritten note would become the last words her parents ever heard from her. It wasn't long after Victoria's death that father died as well, and both father and daughter were buried side by side. 2 lives gone, one by violence, the other by heartbreak. And as the police scrambled to rebuild the broken investigation, one question remained. Who had done this and why? Because this wasn't just a killing. It was daylight murder on a public beach with no witnesses and no answers. In the days following Victoria's murder, fear settled like fog over Bomeris. This wasn't a random crime in a distant city. This was broad daylight, on a quiet beach, surrounded by neighbors, tourists, dog walkers, and surfers. And yet, no one had seen or heard a thing. Locals who once left their doors unlocked began installing deadbolts. Parents pulled children inside at dusk. The beach, once a source of pride, became a place of whispered suspicion. Because if someone could do this and disappear so cleanly, then the killer might still be among them. As the investigation was ongoing, more than 300 people were identified as possible persons of interest. But with no forensic trail, no murder weapon, and the initial investigation compromised, police turned to what little they had. This number was later narrowed down to 4 people based on eyewitness sightings and rumors. They were identified by their jobs: the surfer, the fisherman, the biker, the doctor. Each one had a story, and each one carried a shadow. The surfer. First was the surfer. He was seen on the morning of the murder, jogging along the beach, tan and athletic, described as being in his mid-20s, about 6 feet tall, lean and fit. Witnesses said he looked like a typical surfer, casual and confident. A light-colored Subaru station wagon, parked near the access road, was thought to be his, but neither the man nor the car was ever formally identified. And despite widespread media attention, he never came forward. Why? Was he simply a tourist who didn't realize he was of interest? Or was he something more? To this day, the man known as the surfer has vanished from the investigation, leaving behind only questions. The fisherman. This suspect had a name: Tony Kirkland. He came under suspicion not long after the murder due to a string of deeply unsettling incidents, particularly involving Hilda Jackson, the woman Victoria had befriended days earlier. Weeks before the murder, Hilda had a disturbing encounter with a man near the beach dunes. He asked her in a slow, chilling voice, "What's the fastest way to leave this beach?" Something about his presence, the way he moved, the tone of his question, made her skin crawl. Shortly after, she discovered that her underwear had gone missing from the sand where she'd hidden it while jogging. Then, her neighbor's clothesline was raided. Only the women's garments were taken. Police eventually connected these incidents to Kirkland, a fisherman from a nearby town with a history of inappropriate behavior. Years later, in 1998, a 17-year-old girl filed a restraining order against him for stalking and threats. And when questioned during the Cafasso investigation, Kirkland reportedly relished the attention, even admitting he enjoyed being a suspect. Some theorized that Victoria, bearing a strong resemblance to Hilda, may have been a tragic case of mistaken identity. Still, despite his history, Kirkland was never charged, and police eventually moved on. The biker. His real name was Gary Holmes, a local who wasn't part of any criminal motorcycle gang but was known around town for his moody demeanor and, of course, his bike. What drew suspicion to Holmes was his behavior in the immediate aftermath of the murder. Witnesses described him as acting strangely pale, vacant, like a zombie, someone said. When approached by police, his story kept changing. He couldn't offer a consistent timeline for his whereabouts on the morning of October 11th. Even more troubling, he bore visible injuries, cuts, bruises, and a bloodied arm. He claimed he'd gotten them during a fight with his ex-wife, punching a wall in anger. Police weren't convinced, but despite the inconsistencies and the proximity of his home to the beach, Holmes was eventually ruled out as a viable suspect. Still, for many, his name never left the whispers. The doctor. Of all the suspects, none was more unnerving or more plausible than Dr. Roman Hassel. He was a Czech-born physician, new to the area, and working in St. Helens, a town just a short drive from Bomeris. On paper, he was a professional, but underneath that, he had a troubled past. Before moving to Tasmania, Hassel had served jail time for threatening his wife with a knife. He was known to have a disturbing fascination with bladed weapons. Police learned that on the day of Victoria's murder, he had no clear alibi. He initially claimed to be homesick, but no one could verify his whereabouts during the key hours of the attack. Later, a woman who had dated him told investigators that Hassel had admitted he'd been to the beach that morning, directly contradicting his original statement. Years passed. In 2008, one of his former wives told authorities that when she'd asked him if he'd killed Victoria, his chilling reply was, "Maybe I did. I don't remember." His medical license was also revoked due to medical malpractice. To this day, Dr. Roman Hassel has never been cleared. Police continue to regard him as a serious person of interest, but the evidence just isn't there. In the weeks after Victoria's murder, Bomeris was no longer just a beachside town. It was a crime scene, place of fear and silence. Neighbors stopped waving to each other. People whispered about strangers, but also about locals, the shopkeeper, the jogger, the man walking his dog. Anyone could have done it. That paranoia seeped into every part of life. Doors that had never known locks were suddenly bolted shut. Marriages cracked under the stress. People moved away, and those who stayed behind, like Hilda Jackson, felt the weight of the tragedy every single day. The beach didn't feel like home anymore. It wasn't just the violence of the crime, it was the complete lack of closure, the unknown, and the possibility that the killer had never left. As investigators tried to untangle the truth, some began to question whether Victoria's case was truly isolated. Just 2 years before, in March 1993, a German tourist named Nancy Grunwald had vanished while cycling along Tasmania's east coast, the same region where Victoria was murdered. Nancy, 26, had arrived from New Zealand, rented a bike, and planned to travel down the Tasman Highway. She was last seen around 11 a.m., leaving a hostel in St. Helens. She was never seen again. Nobody, no trace. Some theorized that the two cases, both involving young foreign women, both along Tasmania's remote coastline, both occurring during daylight hours, might be connected. But no link was ever proven. And just like Victoria's killer, Nancy's fate remains a haunting mystery. Had the police acted faster, more precisely? Could things have been different? Experts believe yes. One retired homicide investigator, brought in years after the fact, reviewed the original files and called the early missteps catastrophic. The crime scene was contaminated. Photos were missing. Witnesses weren't properly followed up with. And worst of all, forensic evidence was mishandled or not collected at all. By the time technology caught up, DNA databases, advanced analytics, behavioral profiling, it was too late. The evidence was degraded. The leads were cold. Unless someone talks, the case may never be solved. One final, deeply disturbing detail continues to haunt those familiar with the case. When Victoria's body was examined, 3 of her teeth were missing, violently dislodged during the attack. But They were never recovered. Not on the beach, not near the struggle site, not in her clothing. It led some investigators to wonder, did the killer take them? A trophy? A souvenir? Something only they would ever possess? It was a theory too twisted to dwell on, but too haunting to ignore. After the investigation lost momentum, Victoria's body was flown home to Italy, where she was buried alongside her father. Her mother, heartbroken and robbed of justice, has lived with the weight of that grief for nearly 3 decades. All she has left is a letter, written just days before her daughter's death, describing how happy she was to be in Australia. It's a cruel contrast to the truth that followed. Today, the Tasmanian Police Cold Case Unit continues to monitor the case. They've reopened files, applied new technology, re-interviewed old suspects. There's even a reward for information. And yet, no one has been arrested. No one has confessed. Investigators admit that only a confession, or an unlikely piece of preserved evidence, could finally close the case. Until then, they watch, they wait. And the people of Bomeris? They live with it, quietly, uneasily, because the sand where Victoria died still shifts with the wind, and her story still echoes through every tide. Thank you for watching. Every victim deserves their story told. If you found this story shocking and heartbreaking, subscribe to Crime Uncovered and help keep their memory alive. What do you think about Victoria's murder? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep questioning everything.